So the live stream is now active and this round can begin. Thank you so much.
All right, good evening.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
Is plaintiff ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Before we proceed, we have some pretrial matters we'd like to attend to.
All right.
First of all, we'd like to introduce ourselves. My name is Roman Martinez, and along with my co-counsel, Emily Layton.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
And Alexis Pineda.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
We represent the plaintiff in today's case, the estate of the deceased, Genesis Pedrillo. Would Your Honor like the defense to make introductions before we continue?
Please.
Good evening, Your Honor. My name is Darius Parak, and I, along with my co-counsel, Mr. Akshay Thakur.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good
and
evening.
Miss Aniga Chandramoli.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
Represent the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
In tonight's proceedings. Once the plaintiff is done with their pretrial matters, we do have a few matters in which to attend.
All right. Plaintiff, if you'll proceed with your pretrial matters.
Yes, Your Honor. For a little bit of background, we're pursuing a claim of civil battery against the defendant, Harper Martini, in today's case. At this time, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses, barring party representatives. We'd also like to note for the court that as the plaintiff, we have no party representative in today's case, Your Honor.
Okay. Are there witnesses, defense that is present that Rule 615 would apply to?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we'd like to designate Ms. Martini as our party representative.
All right. And are there other witnesses besides your party representative that would be barred from hearing the testimony?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. Plaintiff, what else do you have?
Your Honor, just to clarify, I believe that Ms. Martini would be the only witness for the defense that will be in trial with us today.
Okay.
As per your permissions, I apologize, Your Honor, your preferences for screen sharing exhibits. Should we ask permission before sharing all exhibits, or may we feel free to share exhibits that have already been admitted into evidence?
You're free to share exhibits that have already been admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. And for the court's notice, in today's case, exhibits 1 through 10 have all been pre-admitted into evidence.
Okay.
And finally, Your Honor, it's common in this jurisdiction to assume that objections are heard outside the earshot of the jury. May we assume the same in your court?
Yes, you may.
May we also assume that exhibits that haven't been admitted into evidence that are being screen shared are kept outside the eyeshot of the jury?
Yes.
With that, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready for trial.
All right. Defense, do you have pretrial matters?
Yes, Your Honor. Only one pretrial matter. We'd like to invoke Midland's Rules of Evidence 603, which constructively swears in all witnesses for this trial.
Okay.
Other than that, we have no pretrial matters. Defense is ready to proceed with the opening statements.
All right. Plaintiff, are you ready to proceed then with your opening? Yeah, I believe you're on mute.
Yes, Your Honor. Excuse me.
Okay. You may proceed.
May it please the court. Follow the poison. From the defendant to the bottle to the blood. June 8th, 2019 was supposed to be a day of celebration. Genesis Patrillo was about to marry the love of her life. She must have been so excited to put on her veil and walk down the aisle. But the night before her wedding, she dies. Instead of having the happiest day of her life, Genesis Patrillo dies of pesticide poisoning. She dies alone in a hospital room, gasping for air, just like the pest the defendant saw her as. Members of the jury, today you'll hear that Genesis Patrillo died of pesticide poisoning at the hands of the defendant, Harper Martini. You'll hear their relationship is one full of arguments and even threats. This is because Miss Martini isn't your average mother-in-law. This isn't a regular case of a mother disliking her son's partner. Instead, Miss Martini's anger goes so far to where she threatens and even kills her son's partner. You'll hear from Mr. Soto, the defendant's son, and he'll tell you the motive she had in today's case. Mr. Soto and the victim were planning on moving to France after their wedding. But when the defendant finds this out, she says, "I don't care if you end up dead. My son is staying with me." So she decides to try and pay off the victim to stay away from her son for good. But when that doesn't work, she tries to take the victim out the hard way by giving her a bottle of poisoned wine. Mr. Soto and a caterer present at the wedding rehearsal will tell you about this bottle of wine. This is a Cara bottle of wine, members of the jury. Remember that name, Cara wine. You'll hear the defendant gives this bottle of wine to the victim and tells her to wait to drink it alone. The caterer at the wedding rehearsal will tell you the opportunity the defendant had to poison this bottle of wine. You'll hear the night before the victim dies, the caterer sees the defendant with this bottle of Cara wine and a canister of pesticides. Finally, you'll hear from the doctor who treats the victim the night of her death. He'll tell you that he finds pesticides in her blood. And that was her cause of death. Members of the jury, today we have to prove to you that Harper Martini is liable for battery. In this, we have to prove to you three things. First, that Miss Martini committed an act, in this case, poisoning Miss Patrio. Secondly, that act was meant to cause harm. And lastly, that act caused the intended harm, in this case, killing Miss Patrio. We have to prove this to you by a preponderance of the evidence. This simply means more likely than not. Now, if this was the defendant's criminal murder trial, we would have to prove this to you beyond a reasonable doubt. But this is not a criminal murder trial, members of the jury. This is a civil battery claim, which means we only have to prove this to you by a preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not. It's a much easier standard for us to meet. All we have to prove to you today is that the defendant poisoning the victim is the most likely explanation in today's case. Members of the jury, throughout today's trial, remember to follow the poison. From the defendant to the bottle of wine to the blood. Genesis Patrio didn't deserve to die, but she does deserve justice. We'll ask you to find Harper Martini liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Does the defense wish to make the opening statement now?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Harper Martini poisoned his business, so Danny Francasio poisoned her wine. It's June 7th, 2019. Two people in love are about to get married, surrounded by their friends and family. The bride's mother-in-law is there, watching happily. She gives her daughter-in-law-to-be a bottle of wine as a symbol of their new relationship. But the next morning, she learns that her daughter-in-law was rushed to the hospital, fell into a coma, and died. She learns that she's being blamed for her daughter-in-law's death. But what she doesn't know is that the wine she gave her daughter-in-law was actually poisoned by her jealous business rival. When you follow the poison as the plaintiff wants you to, you'll see that the person responsible is Danny Francasio. That's why we're here today. The plaintiff has brought one count of battery against Harper Martini for poisoning her daughter-in-law-to-be, Genesis Patrio. And they have to prove not only that Miss Martini had intent to harm Miss Patrio, And they also have to prove how and when Miss Martini put pesticide into that bottle of wine. But members of the jury, not a single witness will tell you that they saw Miss Martini put pesticide into the wine. It's because it wasn't her. The evidence will show that it was Danny Francasio, the owner of the only other winery in this part of the state. You'll learn that competition from Miss Martini's winery caused Mr. Francasio's to suffer. That's when he vowed to do whatever it took to destroy her winery. The evidence will show that after Harper Martini poisoned his business, Danny Francasio poisoned her wine. To show you what really happened, we'll call 3 witnesses. First, you'll hear from Dr. Richard Cannon, an expert in toxicology. Dr. Cannon will explain that there's no way to tell how the pesticide was put in the wine, no way to tell when it was put in the wine, and no way to tell who put it there. But the evidence will show that there was only one person who stood to gain. You'll hear from Austin Lewis, a winemaker who worked for both Miss Martini and Mr. Francasio. Mr. Lewis will explain that as Miss Martini's winery gained customers and clout, Mr. Francasio only became more resentful. The evidence will show that Miss Martini's winery poisoned Mr. Francasio's, replacing it as the #1 winery in the area. Finally, you'll hear from Miss Martini herself. She'll tell you that just 1 month before the wedding, she found an intruder in the winery's bottling area. An intruder she recognized as one of Mr. Francasio's employees. She immediately removed the intruder from the area, but you'll learn that the damage was done. The evidence will show that Danny Francasio succeeded in poisoning Miss Martini's wine and destroying her business. Members of the jury, the evidence will show that after Harper Martini poisoned his business, it was Danny Francasio who poisoned her wine. That's why at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Anaga Chandramoli, will ask that you find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, are you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Casey Soto to the stand.
And Mr. Soto's under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed then.
Can you introduce yourself to the jury?
You need to unmute yourself.
My apologies.
That's right. You may proceed.
My name is Casey Soto.
How are you related to this case, Mr. Soto?
Well, Genesis Petrillo was my fiance, and my mom is the defendant, Harper Martini.
Before we get to the defendant, what happened to your fiance?
Genesis died the night before our wedding. Her death certificate says that she died from pesticide poisoning.
Mr. Soto, I'm sorry for your loss. Would it be okay if I showed you a picture of your fiance?
Sure, I don't mind.
Your Honor, we'll be showing Exhibit 1, pre-admitted Exhibit 1. Mr. Soto, do you know when this picture was taken?
Yeah, that was taken at the Botanical Gardens right before she proposed to me. Her friend Drew was just testing out the camera on her, and the sun caught her face perfectly. It's my favorite picture of Genesis. I miss her.
Now that we know more about you and Miss Petrillo, I have to ask Mr. Soto, are you testifying voluntarily today?
No, I'm not. I didn't want any lawsuits, and I didn't want to testify against my own mom, but the court said I had to be here.
All right, Mr. Soto, I just have a few questions, then we can get you out of here. Let's talk about your mom, the defendant. Did her and Genesis get along?
No. From the day my mom met Genesis, she told me to leave her and that Genesis was not good for me. But I loved Genesis, so I stood up to my mom. And ever since then, she just constantly fought with Genesis. I know that future in-laws are not supposed to get along, but my mom took it to a whole other level.
What do you mean your mom took it to a whole other level?
Well, when Genesis and I got engaged, my mom was already furious. And when we were getting married, Genesis and I were planning to move to France. You know, it was Genesis's dream to live there, and I tried to keep it a secret from my mom as long as I could because I just couldn't imagine how she would react if she found out that I was leaving. And one day she did find out.
What did the defendant do when she found out you were planning to move?
My mom threatened Genesis. She said, "My son is staying with me. I don't care if you stay. I don't care if you end up dead, but my son is staying with me no matter what." I was so disappointed in my mom. I knew she cared about me, but it hurt to hear her say that to the person that I loved.
After the defendant threatened Miss Patrio, how did wedding planning go?
Things got worse, especially closer to the wedding. At the rehearsal dinner, my mom even snapped at Genesis again.
What did the defendant say when she snapped at Miss Patrio?
She told Genesis that she shouldn't even have bothered showing up. And then Genesis told my mom she couldn't even pay her to stay away. I mean, what does that mean?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. Motion to strike.
Response, Your Honor?
Please.
We're not using this statement for the truth of the matter asserted. We're using it for the effect on Mr. Patrio.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Soto, would it surprise you if later today in trial there's evidence that the defendant tried to pay off your fiance to stay away from you?
Yeah, that would.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
I'm not asking the witness to speculate. I'm asking him if it would surprise him if a theoretical thing happened. That's not speculation.
Your Honor, that is a hypothetical.
I'm gonna grant the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Mr. Soto, after Genesis told your mom that she couldn't pay her to stay away, what happened next?
Well, after that, I thought things had settled down. The reception was going better than I had expected, and at the end of the night, my mom even gave a bottle of wine and told Genesis that it was just for her.
Would you recognize a picture of that bottle of wine if I showed it to you?
Yeah.
Your Honor, we'll be sharing Exhibits 2A and Exhibits 2B. They're pre-admitted. Mr. Patrio, is this that bottle of wine and the label that the defendant gave to your fiance?
Yes, that's it.
So after your mom gave this Cara wine bottle to Genesis Patrio and said that it was just for her, do you know if Miss Patrio drank any?
Yeah, I saw her pour a couple of glasses and she drank some, but I don't know how much she drank. I went to bed early that night.
What happened when you woke up the next morning?
I started getting ready at 7, and I had no idea where Genesis was. She never came to the room, and I thought it might be some bridal superstition. And then all of a sudden, our friend Angel walks into the room with the worst look on his face. And he told me that Genesis was in a coma. And so I rushed to the hospital as fast as I could.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. Motion to strike.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
It's already on the record that Miss Patrio died of pesticide poisoning and her death certificate is pre-admitted under Exhibit B. Furthermore, Your Honor, if opposing counsel is objecting to the statement Genesis, we're using this statement for the effect of the listener on Mr. Patrio, this statement purely caused him to go to the hospital. That's all we're using it for today.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Soto, when you got to the hospital, what happened?
We got there 5 minutes too late. It was already gone, and I never got to say goodbye.
Mr. Soto, do you know that your mom is being accused of poisoning your fiance?
Yeah, I know my mom's being accused, but she's my mom, and I love her. I don't think that she's some murderer, but my mom hated Genesis, and with all the threats and the anger and the bottle of wine, I don't know who to trust.
No further questions.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Soto. I understand that this can be difficult, so I'm going to limit my questions, okay?
Okay.
Mr. Soto, I want to focus on your original wedding plans. You were supposed to be married at Rosie and Pedro's, correct?
Yeah, we had originally planned on having it there.
The winery was owned by Danny Francasio?
Yeah, he was a family friend of ours.
You met with him to discuss the pricings of the wedding,
That's correct.
how your wedding would look?
Yeah, the bridal party and I came up with some plans, so we talked about that.
Exactly. It was going to be perfect, right?
Yeah,
So you were set on Rosie and Pedro's.
no, definitely not set on it, but we had already had conversations about what our wedding would look like there.
So you discussed that you were going to have your wedding at Rosie and Pedro's.
Yeah, that was the original plan, but things changed.
You changed it to Peony Estates.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, Mr. Soto, when you changed it to Peony Estates, that took away business from Danny Francasio's winery, didn't it?
Yeah, it was just our wedding, though, no one else.
But that's yes to my question, that it took away business.
Yeah, our wedding.
Now, Mr. Soto, I want to move on to the night of the rehearsal dinner. You were with Mr. Patrio and Miss Martini on the night, right?
I was with them, yeah.
Now, at no point did you see Miss Martini put pesticide into the car or wine.
No, I didn't see that.
And at no point did you see anyone put pesticide into the car or wine.
No, I wasn't really focused on the wine bottle.
Exactly. You have no idea how pesticide got into that wine.
No, I don't.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Plaintiff, are you ready to call your next witness? Or do you have some additional questions for this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Okay.
May Mr. Soto be excused?
He may be. You ready to call your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Sam Arnold to the stand.
All right. And I believe she is sworn as well. You may.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening. Can you introduce yourself to the jury?
Hi, I'm Samantha Arnold, but everyone calls me Sam.
What do you do for a living, Miss Arnold?
I'm a chef, not a self-proclaimed, self-taught TikTok chef. I'm the real deal. I went to culinary school and everything.
How exactly did you become a chef?
Ever since I was a little girl, I knew it was what I wanted to do. I mean, I knew the different types of knives before I knew my ABCs. In case you were wondering, there's the fillet knife, the cheese knife, the bread knife. The list just goes on and on. I actually attended La Robe en Bleu in Paris, and I've worked for some of the most prestigious kitchens in France. When my dad got sick, I had to come back here to Midlands, but it all turned out okay because now I own my own catering service.
So how are you related to today's case, Ms. Arnold?
I catered the wedding and the wedding rehearsal of Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto.
How'd you end up with that job?
Well, Miss Martini and I have been business partners since 2016. Back then, my business was struggling a little bit. The people of Midlands just don't respond well to French cuisine. They're more interested in Gordon Ramsay and Rachel Ray. Well, Miss Martini, she helped me turn a profit, and ever since then, we've been great friends and we've had a great business relationship.
So besides Miss Martini, did you know anyone else from the wedding?
Other than Genesis and Casey, I only knew some employees.
Well, you said that you knew Genesis, the victim in today's case. How much did you know her?
Look, I'm not one for gossip. I'm more interested in learning how to make the perfect zuppa toscana. But Miss Martini would occasionally tell me some things about Genesis. She told me that Genesis was selfish and immature and that she wanted Casey to marry anybody but Genesis. From what Miss Martini told me, it seemed like Genesis and Miss Martini paired worse than red wine and tuna salad.
Did the relationship ever seem to improve to you?
Not from what I could tell. They were always fighting.
Well, I want to talk about the day in question specifically, the wedding rehearsal. Were you at the winery at Peony Estates on that day?
Yes, I was.
Can you walk us through how that day started for you, Miss Arnold?
Of course. I arrived at Peony Estates at 11 a.m. on the dot. I'm very punctual that way. And then I headed straight to the best room in the winery, the kitchen.
Of course. What did you see when you walked into the kitchen?
Well, as I was actually walking to the kitchen, I heard Miss Martini. She said that she wanted the kitchen to be clean. I thought that was pretty weird. I mean, I thought to myself, if the kitchen's completely clean without any utensils or vegetables, what are we gonna cook? And then I walked into the kitchen and I saw Miss Martini with some wine. And I also saw a canister of pesticide on a counter in the kitchen.
So after you saw the defendant in the kitchen with both wine and pesticide, did she explain what she was doing with that pesticide?
Yes, she did. I asked her, and I heard her mumble something about it being for pests like Genesis. I was pretty confused, and then she looked up and said she was joking. Honestly, I didn't think much of it. I was too focused on my food.
Well, after the defendant said that that pesticide was for pests like Genesis, did you ask her about the wine?
I did. She told me that she was finalizing gifts for wedding guests. They were all the same bottle of Horizon wine, except for one. It was different from the rest.
Now, you just mentioned that there was only one bottle that was different from the rest. Can you tell us a little bit more about that bottle?
Of course I can. I remember it was a red bottle of Cara wine. Miss Martini told me it was a gift for Genesis.
Would you recognize pictures of that bottle and its label if I showed them to you?
I would.
Your Honor, at this time, we'll be screen sharing pre-admitted exhibits 2A and 2B. All right, Ms. Arnold, is this the bottle and the label you were talking about?
Yes, that looks just like what I saw.
Did the defendant tell you anything else about this bottle?
She did. Miss Martini told me that this bottle of wine would solve all of her problems. That was pretty interesting to me. I mean, the only wine that could solve all of my problems is the Bordeaux from Gironde, but to each his own, I suppose.
Well, did the defendant explain what she meant when she said that this bottle of wine would solve all of her problems?
No, and honestly, I never asked. I was too busy cutting my cucumbers.
All right, Miss Arnold. So back to the rehearsal, then. How'd that go?
It went very smoothly, all because of my food, of course.
Well, more specifically, back to that bottle of wine. At the wedding rehearsal, did you ever see that bottle again?
I did actually. I saw Genesis Petrillo with that bottle. Miss Martini actually gave it to her, and she said that that bottle of wine was just for Genesis.
Well, what happened after the defendant told the victim to wait, drink that wine until she was all alone?
Well, honestly, I wasn't that focused on what was happening at the wedding rehearsal for the rest of the night. I was too focused on my food. But I do know that the next morning, Genesis was rushed to the hospital.
I pass the witness, Your Honor.
You may cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Miss Arnold.
Good evening.
I want to talk to you about your relationship with Miss Martini. Now, you've known her for quite a while, haven't you?
Yes, I have, since 2016.
So you've developed a good business relationship with her.
Yes, a business relationship.
And you know that she's very protective of her winery, right?
I do know that, yes.
She wouldn't do anything to harm her own business, right?
Objection, Your Honor. This question calls for speculation.
I'm going to allow it.
Yes, Your Honor. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Miss Martini wouldn't do anything to harm her own business, in your opinion, right?
I mean, I don't think so. I don't know any businesswoman or businessman that would try to harm their own business, but honestly, this is just my opinion.
All right, Miss Arnold. Well, I want to move on to June 7th, 2019, the night of the rehearsal dinner. Like you said, you were at Peony Estates as the caterer.
Of course, it was my food that made it such a great event.
And you went into the kitchen, right?
I did.
And like you said on direct examination, you saw Miss Martini handling some wine bottles, right?
Yes, I asked her about it actually, and she said she was finalizing gifts for wedding guests.
So to be clear, you saw her in the kitchen, not in the wine bottling area, right?
That's correct. The kitchen is my home. That's the only place I was, honestly.
So when you saw her handling those bottles of wine, all the bottles were corked and sealed, right?
I wasn't really paying attention, but yes, I suppose.
And you asked her and you saw a canister of pesticide on the counter.
I did. In the kitchen, there was a canister of pesticide on a counter.
And so you asked her what that pesticide was for, right?
That's correct, I did.
And like you said on direct examination, she said it was for pests like Genesis. That was your testimony?
Yes, she mumbled something along those lines.
But then she said she was just kidding, right?
Yeah, she looked up and said she was just kidding. It was pretty confusing, but honestly, I was too busy focused on my food.
Now, when you asked Miss Martini what that pesticide was for, she didn't seem nervous, did she?
Objection, Your Honor. This question clearly calls for speculation.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
I'm simply asking this witness to testify based on her 5 senses. She has the ability to say whether Miss Martini seemed nervous, whether she was sweating, shifting her eyes around. This is well within her ability to testify to.
I'm going to overrule the objection. Go ahead and answer the question.
Miss Martini, when you asked, or Miss Arnold, when you asked Miss Martini what that pesticide was for, she wasn't nervous, was she?
No, she wasn't nervous.
She didn't try to hide the pesticide at all?
No, you're right.
She answered you directly, didn't she?
That's correct, she did.
Now, Miss Arnold, you don't know how the pesticide got into the Cara wine bottle, do you?
Oh, no, I have no idea how that happened.
When you were watching Miss Martini, you never saw her uncork the bottle of wine?
No, all I saw was her gift it to Genesis.
So is that a yes? You never saw her uncork the Cara wine?
Yes,
You never saw her put pesticide into the bottle, did you?
definitely not. I mean, it was a wedding rehearsal.
You never saw her resealing the bottle of wine?
No,
And you don't know if someone else put pesticide into that 2019 Cara wine, do you, Miss Arnold?
no, I don't know that.
Thank you. Your Honor, nothing further at this time.
All right. Can this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. We ask that Ms. Arnold be allowed to step down.
All right. You may call your next witness.
The plaintiff calls Dr. Kwan to the stand. Dr. Jimin Kwan.
All right, and I believe he's under oath as well.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed then.
Good evening, doctor. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, I'm Dr. Jimin Kwan.
Can you tell us about your educational background?
Yes, I received my bachelor's in biology with a minor in chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And then I got my medical degree from the University of North Carolina.
What about your professional experience? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I was a resident at Emory's Department of Emergency Medicine, where I also completed a fellowship in medical toxicology. I'm currently the chief physician at River Valley Hospital in Midlands.
Okay, doctor, do you have any specialties?
Yes, while I am qualified to treat all kinds of patients that come into the ER, I do have a background in medical toxicology, so those kinds of cases are typically directed to me. I've even published multiple articles in the field of toxicology.
And doctor, are you being paid for your testimony today?
No, I'm not. As an emergency physician, I'm not hired for trials. I'm just here to talk about what I found whenever I was treating Genesis.
Okay, so how are you involved in today's case?
I was the attending physician the night of June 7th when Genesis Petrillo came to the ER.
Before we talk about what you observed about Genesis, I do want to talk more about how you treat your patients. What's the process for treating someone at the ER?
Well, ER doctors follow the same method. It's called differential diagnosis. Essentially, when you're coming to a diagnosis, you have to follow the path that the symptoms are leading you down. The first step would be to analyze these first-tier symptoms, which include anything that the patient verbally tells us, shows us, or any abnormalities in their vital signs. After that, we move on to the second step, which is analyzing the second-tier symptoms. These can be anything that we find from running tests on the patient, taking x-rays, MRIs, things like that. Really anything to help us see beyond that surface level from the first-tier symptoms.
And do other emergency physicians use this kind of differential diagnosis?
Yes, all the time. As an yes, this is a very common, it's a very common method used in the ER field and in medical toxicology as well. In fact, it's the gold standard.
And what does an ER doctor need in order to perform differential diagnosis?
Well, I need the patient, of course, to run tests on and x-rays, things like that. And then the patient's available medical records and any necessary medical equipment, but that can differ per patient.
So did you use this differential diagnosis on the victim, Genesis Petrillo?
Yes, I did.
And did you have all the necessary materials to do that with Genesis Petrillo?
Yes, I had everything I needed.
Okay, so let's discuss what you observed the night you treated her. What symptoms was she displaying?
Well, the symptoms really changed over time. However, when Miss Petrillo first came to the ER, she was experiencing nausea, stomach pain, and was vomiting. I was also able to smell alcohol on her breath, so I admitted her into the ER under the assumption that she was experiencing alcohol poisoning.
Well, you mentioned her symptoms changed over time. Can you explain that to the jury, please?
Yes. Over time, Miss Petrillo started to develop some unusual symptoms that were inconsistent with alcohol poisoning. She began having muscle spasms, her pulse slowed, her pupils contracted, and she began tearing excessively. These symptoms ruled out alcohol poisoning, and led me down a different path.
What did you think her condition was if it wasn't alcohol poisoning?
In my experience, these symptoms indicated that this was a pesticide poisoning case. So I ordered some tests in the victim's blood and vomit to confirm that diagnosis.
Are these the only tests you're familiar with in today's case?
No, after the victim's death, I was able to review a test from a bottle of wine, that the victim drank prior to arriving at the emergency room.
And based on the results of these tests, what were you able to conclude, if anything?
The results led me to conclude how the victim was poisoned with pesticide, I actually brought a visual aid to explain my conclusions.
Your Honor, permission to share the doctor's visual aid? We've shown it to opposing counsel.
You may do so.
All right, doctor, can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is a visual aid that I made to summarize my findings. On the left, I'll be showing the test results, and on the right, I'll be explaining my analysis.
What was the first test you analyzed?
The first test was run on Miss Petrio's blood. I was looking out for her acetylcholinesterase levels.
Can you tell the jury what that is, please?
Yes, acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that functions as an aid to your nervous system. When someone is poisoned, they begin to produce low levels of this enzyme. In this case, Miss Petrio was experiencing low levels of acetylcholinesterase, and my next test was able to fully confirm her condition.
What was the next test?
I ordered a screening test on Miss Petrio's blood and the stomach contents in her stomach. The positive test results affirmed that there was pesticide in Miss Petrio's blood.
So now that we know there was pesticide in the victim's blood, did the test show you anything else?
Yes, the stomach contents were isolated to analyze where the poison came from. The food in Miss Petrio's stomach tested negative for pesticide, but the wine that the victim drank tested positive. This led me to conclude the wine is what poisoned the victim.
So now that we've heard your conclusion that the wine had poison in it, let's talk about the bottle. You mentioned you reviewed a test of the bottle, Dr. Kwan?
Yes, the bottle tested positive for pesticides. In fact, there was a high amount of pesticide in the bottle.
Okay, so now that we've discussed the poison in the blood and the bottle, let's discuss your final conclusion. After treating the victim and reviewing these tests, what was your conclusion?
I concluded that the victim was poisoned with a bottle of wine, which ultimately led to her death.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Ross,
Yes, Your Honor.
you may proceed.
Good evening, Dr. Kwan. Now, I'd like to talk about your differential diagnosis. After you completed your diagnosis, you gave Miss Petrio the antidote for pesticide poisoning.
Yes, that's correct.
And you had ordered 3 different types of tests, as you noted in your direct examination.
Yes, I did.
But to be clear, Dr. Kwan, you gave Miss Petrio the antidote before you received the result of the blood test.
Yes, her symptoms were enough to conclude that she was actually experiencing a pesticide poisoning, which is why I needed to act fast, because I couldn't tell how long the pesticide had been in her system. Unfortunately, I was too late and she ended up dying.
But that's a yes to my question, Dr. Kwan. You gave her the antidote for pesticide before you received the results of the blood test.
Yes, I did.
You gave her the antidote for pesticide before you received the results of the test you did on the body.
That's correct.
And you gave her the antidote for pesticide before you received the results of the test you did on the bottle.
Yes, that's correct. If I'd waited for any of those, it would have been way too late.
Well, let's talk about why you might have done that. You're a board member on an anti-pesticide organization, aren't you?
That's correct.
You hope that this case will lead to the banning of pesticides.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we don't have chemical pesticides, cases like this wouldn't happen. It's really unfortunate to see people like Genesis suffering from chemical pesticides.
So that's a yes, Dr. Kwan. You hope that this case specifically will cause pesticides to be banned.
Yes.
Let's move on to the limits of your conclusion. To test for pesticide, you ran a poisons and toxicology analysis, right?
I did.
And this type of test tells you about the presence of pesticide.
That's correct.
It returns either a positive or a negative.
That's correct.
It doesn't give you an exact measurement of how much pesticide is present.
No, it's not quantitative, it's just qualitative. So you only get the positive or negative. Typically,
Right.
Sorry, you can
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, typically it comes back negative, but in this case, again, Ms. Petrillo did have pesticide in her blood, so it came back positive.
Right. But even with that positive result, you can't give us an exact measurement of how much pesticide was present.
No, it's, again, not quantitative.
You also can't tell us how much pesticide was in the wine that Miss Petrillo drank.
I believe there was an isofenfos level in the wine, but again, we don't know how long that pesticide had remained in the wine, so I can't give you an exact quantitative measurement, no.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel will be sharing Exhibit 10.
Okay.
Your Honor, or Dr. Kwan, this is the test that was done on the empty bottle of Cara wine, correct?
Oh, yes, this is.
And if we look at the additional notes by client at the bottom of this, it says that the sample was taken from the empty bottle of wine found in the trash, right?
That's correct. That's what it says.
Thank you for sharing your screen, co-counsel. Your Honor, reading stipulation 17 onto the record, a canister of bug-off pesticide was found in the same dumpster in which the police found Exhibit 2A, the empty bottle of Cara wine. Now, Dr. Kwan, as you mentioned, you also can't tell us when the pesticide was put in the wine.
No, I was really only treating Genesis. I wasn't working with the wine bottle really at all.
Right. You also can't tell us if any one specific person put pesticide into the wine.
No, I couldn't tell you that.
Dr. Kwan, your conclusion doesn't pertain to who is responsible for Miss Petrillo's poisoning.
No, that's not what I'm trying to conclude here. I'm just talking about what caused Genesis Petrillo to die, and that was pesticide poisoning.
Right. So it's a yes to my question. You can't tell us who is at fault for Miss Petrillo's poisoning.
No, that's not really what I'm trying to conclude here.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Does plaintiff have any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor, we have no redirect. May the witness step down?
You may be excused.
And Your Honor, before we rest our case in chief, the plaintiff would like to also read a stipulation onto the record.
You may proceed.
Stipulation 21. Both parties agree that Danny Francasio has never been to Peony Estates. With that, Your Honor, the plaintiff rests its case in chief.
All right. Defense, you're ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Cannon to the stand.
I believe Dr. Cannon is under oath, so you may proceed.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Hello, I am Dr. Richard Cannon.
What do you do for a living?
Currently, I am a medical consultant.
What do you do as a medical consultant?
Well, as doctors, we're in the business of life and death, and I believe that we only get better by checking each other's work. I believe it is imperative to ensure that doctors make the right conclusions, and as a consultant, I do so by reviewing cases.
Where did you go to school, doctor?
I got my medical degree from Harvard.
And what experience do you have in the field of medicine?
I worked at Mass General Hospital for 10 years, serving as the director of toxicology. I then became a professor at Midlands Medical School.
Are you published in the field of toxicology?
Yes, I am. I've written over 50 peer-reviewed articles.
And how are you involved in this case?
I conducted a scientific audit in order to determine the cause of death of Miss Genesis Petrillo.
What evidence did you consider as part of your audit?
I reviewed the work of Miss Petrio's treating physician, Dr. Jimin Kwan, and a list of Miss Petrio's medical records, as well as an eyewitness affidavit.
Can you please explain to the jury what method you used in your analysis?
I used a standard comparative analysis that allows me to apply my knowledge in the field of toxicology to the data I was provided regarding Miss Petrio's death.
Is this method standard in your field?
Yes, it is. It's the same process I've used in all 35 cases I've testified in, and it's even taught in Midlands Medical School.
And did you apply the standard comparative analysis reliably to this case?
Yes, I did.
Now, Dr. Cannon, what was Dr. Kwan's conclusion about the cause of death?
Dr. Kwan concluded definitively that Miss Petrio died of pesticide poisoning. However, there are uncertainties associated with that conclusion.
What uncertainties are there with his conclusion?
Well, I agree that Miss Petrio most likely died as a result of pesticide poisoning. But there's significant uncertainty as to whether the amount of ingested pesticide was enough to be lethal on its own.
Why is that uncertain?
We do not know the specific amount of pesticide that Miss Petrio ingested.
Why not?
It's actually not possible to know that amount. The tests that Dr. Kwan used can only determine whether or not someone has been exposed to pesticides.
So, Dr. Cannon, if a lethal amount of pesticide wasn't ingested, how could pesticide have contributed to Miss Petrio's death?
As Dr. Kwan noted in her report, the presence of alcohol in Miss Petrio's system could have interacted negatively with the pesticide.
What was Miss Petrio's blood alcohol content?
Well, about 2 hours after being admitted to the hospital, Miss Petrio's blood alcohol content was measured to be 0.16%. However, it is important to note that BAC, or blood alcohol content, can decrease over time as alcohol is eliminated from the bloodstream, meaning Miss Petrio's BAC could have been considerably higher earlier that night.
What would the effect of this higher amount of alcohol be on Miss Petrio?
As Dr. Kwan explained in her report, when alcohol and pesticide are both present in the body, they can react negatively to each other, exacerbating the effects of the pesticide. It's entirely possible that a small amount of pesticide was ingested, but in combination with the alcohol, it could have been fatal.
Dr. Cannon, what's your final conclusion about Miss Petrio's cause of death?
Given these possible scenarios, my final conclusion is that Miss Petrio most likely died as a result of pesticide poisoning. If the dose of pesticide wasn't lethal on its own, then the combination of both pesticide and alcohol could have been fatal.
Dr. Cannon, I'd also like to talk about some of the limitations of the data you considered. Can you tell us anything about how the pesticide entered the wine?
No, there is no way of knowing exactly how the pesticide entered the wine.
Does any of the testing you considered indicate when the pesticide was put in the wine?
It is also not possible to determine when the pesticide was put in the wine. There is no data to show if the wine had been contaminated during its initial creation or weeks before ingestion.
Can you tell us scientifically if any one specific person put pesticide in the wine?
Scientifically, no. There is no explanation if any specific person put the pesticide in that wine bottle.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. No further questions at this time.
Ross,
Yes, Your Honor.
you may proceed.
Dr. Kwan. Now, Doctor, you mentioned how alcohol can negatively interact with a body during your direct examination, correct?
Yes, I talked about the findings in Dr. Kwan's report, correct.
Where I just want to clarify, the victim's symptoms contradicted alcohol poisoning. Wouldn't you agree?
Initially, the victim's symptoms were were consistent with alcohol poisoning, but later in the night, they began to be more consistent with pesticide poisoning.
Not only were they consistent with pesticide poisoning, they contradicted alcohol poisoning, right?
It is possible, yes.
And doctor, let's talk about what we can agree on. Like you mentioned on direct, you think the victim drinking poisoned wine is the most likely cause of death.
Yes, I believe it is the most likely cause of death in this case.
And alcohol poisoning leading to the death is highly unlikely. Isn't that true?
Correct. The alcohol poisoning alone is highly unlikely.
Doctor, is it your testimony here today that you're concluding that both of them together caused the death?
No, it's actually Dr. Kwan's conclusion in her report that I am stating as well.
You're telling the jury Dr. Kwan concluded this was alcohol poisoning and pesticide poisoning?
Excuse me. What I meant to say is she noted it. That wasn't her exact conclusion. However, it was in her report, which is what I used to form my conclusions.
All right, doctor, but I just want to get it very clear for the jury what's in each report. Dr. Kwan concluded this was not alcohol poisoning, right?
Dr. Kwan concluded definitively that this was pesticide poisoning.
And you agree with her that it's the most likely explanation?
Yes, my conclusion is that it's the most likely explanation in this case that the wine was contaminated.
Okay, but I want to give the jury a little more context about your testimony. First of all, you were hired by the defense, isn't that right?
That's true.
You're being paid for your testimony.
I am being compensated for the work I did on this report, yes.
One of your biggest clients is actually a pesticide company, right?
Yes.
And you and the CEO of that pesticide company talked about this case before trial.
That's correct. We had talked about this case before trial, and the CEO asked that I find pesticides not be responsible for the cause of death in this case. However, my report is objective and well-founded, and I found that pesticide poisoning was, in fact, the most likely cause.
Doctor, I want to go step by step. The CEO did tell you that pesticides shouldn't be blamed for this death, right?
Yes, he thought it would be best if pesticides were not found to be the cause of death.
And today you are saying that alcohol was also involved. So I do want to ask you these questions. You don't want to lose this client, do you?
Right, I don't want to lose this client, but it's also important to be truthful and objective in my report.
You admit that you would lose a lot of money if you lost this client.
I would, yes.
Doctor, today you're testifying on behalf, on the defense of the owner of a pesticide company. Isn't that true?
No, I'm testifying on behalf of the owner of a winery, not a pesticide company.
Excuse me, a winery that uses chemical pesticide just like that CEO. Isn't that correct?
Yes, as most wineries do.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Right,
Your Honor, brief redirect, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Now, Dr. Cannon, opposing counsel asked you some questions about alcohol poisoning. Is it your conclusion today that alcohol poisoning was Ms. Petrio's cause of death?
No, in fact, it is not my conclusion. My conclusion is that pesticide poisoning is the most likely cause of death.
So did you listen to that CEO of the pesticide company?
No, of course not. Lives are at stake, and as a medical consultant, it is my job to be objective, fair, and truthful.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Nothing further, Your Honor. May this witness be seated, Your Honor?
Any recross?
No recross from the plaintiff, Your Honor.
All right. He may be excused. Do you have any other witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Mr. Austin Lewis to the stand.
All right. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening.
Good evening.
Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Danny Francazio.
Mr. Lewis, could you, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm not working right now, but I used to be the head winemaker over at Peony Estates.
And Mr. Lewis, how did you get into the wine industry?
Wine was the family business. I lived on a vineyard growing up, but I was pretty good at football and even got drafted by the Dallas Cowboys. I got myself a couple of rings and I ended up tearing my ACL. And I realized in that moment I had to refocus. So I went back to school. I got my degree in business and I ended up in the family business after all.
Mr. Lewis, let's circle back to that point about Peony Estates. Did you know the owner, Harper Martini?
Yeah, she was my boss at Peony Estates. Funny enough, she also used to work with me at Danny Francasio's winery.
Mr. Lewis, who's Danny Francasio?
He owns the only other winery in the valley. It's called Rosie and Pedro's. Working there was actually my first job after I graduated.
What was it like working for Mr. Francasio?
It wasn't good. I mean, the man has no clue how to make wine. He thought his biology degree somehow qualified him to be a winemaker, but there's a lot more than science that goes into winemaking. I mean, wine, it needs love. I'll never forget one time he tasted a Cabernet and he called it a Chardonnay.
And what do you know about Miss Martini's and Mr. Francasio's relationship?
Well, based on what I saw, it seemed like they got along pretty well when they worked together. But when Harper suddenly announced she would be opening up her own winery, Danny went off his rocker.
Well, you work at Peony Estates now. How did you end up working for Harper?
Yeah, Harper asked me to be her head winemaker. I mean, sampling wine for every batch? Come on, that's the dream. And besides, Harper was an experienced winemaker. I was excited to work for her.
How did Danny react when he heard you accepted Harper's offer?
He was furious. I'd never seen him that mad before. He called me a traitor, but that wasn't half as bad as what he said about Harper.
What did he say about Miss Martini?
When Harper said she was leaving, Danny exploded. He said he would do whatever it took, no matter how long it took.
Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay under Rule 801.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This isn't an exception to hearsay, as it's showing Mr. Francasio's intent to cause a winery harm, which goes directly to the defense's case in chief.
Oh,
May I respond, Your Honor?
yes, you may.
Your Honor, I believe that opposing counsel is referring to Rule 8033 to show intent. However, we don't know what that clear intent is based on this hearsay statement. The statement that Mr. Francasio made was that they would do whatever it takes, no matter how long it takes, to make sure Peony Estates goes down. That's not any specific intent on what he planned to do. Therefore, we can't take this statement by its truth value through this exception, Your Honor. The intent is not specific, and therefore this statement does not fall under Rule 8033.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
You may.
As opposing counsel has said, Mr. Francasio said that he would do whatever it took, no matter how long it took, to make this winery fail. That is a clear statement of intent in this case, Your Honor, and therefore falls under the exception 8033.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I'll allow this.
Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Now, Mr. Lewis, let me re-ask my question. What did he say about Miss Martini?
Again, when Harper said she was leaving, Danny, he exploded. He said he would do whatever it took, no matter how long it took, to make sure Harper's winery fails.
Now, Mr. Lewis, I want to talk to you about your time working at Peony Estates. Did the winery have any security?
Not that I saw. I mean, we didn't have security guards or anything like that. In fact, the winery was open to the public.
What do you mean by open to the public?
We would hold weekly winery tours that anyone could attend. Of course, we did have our areas that were employees only.
Have you ever seen anyone sneak onto the property?
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I remember someone sneaking into the restricted area. I caught them snooping around the kitchen and the bottling area where we kept our unreleased 2019 wine. I still have no idea how he got there.
Thank you. No further questions.
Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Lewis, like you said, you used to work for Danny Francazio.
Yes, that's right.
I want to talk a little bit about how you personally about Mr. Francazio.
I'm sorry, I believe you froze.
I want to talk about your feelings toward Mr. Francazio, Mr. Lewis. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine.
You have nothing but hate for Danny Francazio.
Yes, that's true.
It is the sincerest desire in your heart to see Mr. Francazio ruined.
Objection, Your Honor, lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Yes.
If the opposing counsel can provide some foundation for this line of question, in order to provide the jury an easier way of understanding.
Any response?
Could you repeat yourself? I'm sorry, it cut out.
Yes. I was hoping that you could provide some foundation for your line of question.
Your Honor, I believe that no foundation is necessary to ask this witness how he feels about Mr. Francazio. I'm asking him whether or not it's true that he wants to see Mr. Francazio ruined. That doesn't require any foundation.
Yeah, I overrule the objection. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Lewis, you want to see Mr. Francazio utterly ruined.
I mean, I don't like the guy. After he fired my mom, I was lost for a little bit. And when she passed away, I didn't know what to do.
Mr. Lewis, we know you don't like the guy. You just said you have nothing but hate for him. But I'm asking, it's your desire to see Mr. Francazio utterly ruined, right?
Again, yeah, I don't like the guy.
Now let's talk about your stakes in today's case. You're actually a 10% owner of Miss Martini's winery, right?
Yes, that's right.
And you don't want Miss Martini to lose this case.
I don't believe I ever said that.
So is it your testimony today, Mr. Lewis? Well, let's talk about why you don't want that to happen. If the defendant loses this case, the winery would most likely shut down, right?
I think so. I handle the winemaking process at Peony Estate.
And if that happened, you'd be out of a job.
Yes, out of my job at Peony Estates. That's right.
You'd be out of a lot of money.
I think so. Again, I'm not too savvy in the financials. I deal with winemaking.
Well, you own 10% of Peony Estates, so if it were to shut down, you would lose a lot of money.
Again, I'm not sure. I'm not too savvy with the finances.
Mr. Lewis, is it your testimony today that you don't think you would lose a lot of money if the winery shut down?
I do think so. I just said I'm not sure.
Now let's talk about the defendant's knowledge of pesticides. The defendant, Ms. Martini, told you she was familiar with where you store pesticides.
Yes, as were all of our employees at Peony Estates.
She told you she knew they could be poisonous.
Yes.
She told you she knew they could even be fatal.
Yes, which is why we took so many precautions at the winery. It's why we threw away 25% of our harvest, and that's why we took all the precautions before spraying.
Now, Mr. Lewis, I'm not asking about what you did or the entire company. I'm talking about Ms. Martini. And she also told you that when pesticides are inside of a drink, you can't see that they're there.
I believe she was telling me a story about an employee that got very sick from drinking contaminated wine.
Right, and she told you that in that scenario, you couldn't see the pesticides inside that drink.
Yeah, you couldn't see or smell it. Very scary.
Exactly, you couldn't smell them either.
Yes, as I said.
And Ms. Martini knew all of this even though she doesn't work with pesticides on the daily.
Well, again, all of our employees are trained in pesticide safety. It's important for everyone at Peony Estates to know how dangerous pesticides could be.
Well, now that we've talked about what the defendant knew, the dangers of pesticides, I want to talk about her relationship with the victim today, Genesis Petrillo. The defendant told you that she hated Genesis, right?
Yes, I know they didn't like each other.
Well, she told you she hated her.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of my mother-in-law.
She told you that she hated her because she thought she was a bad influence on her son.
Yeah, my mother-in-law thought the same thing about me.
She told you repeatedly that she hoped the wedding would be called off.
Yeah, she did.
Called off, right, Mr. Lewis?
I'm sorry, you froze.
The wedding was called off, right, Mr. Lewis?
I believe so. I mean, Genesis is gone now.
The defendant told you that if she could push a button and make the victim disappear, she would absolutely do it, right?
Yeah. I remember my mother-in-law said the same thing about me, and now we're best friends.
The defendant said that, right, Mr. Lewis?
Yeah.
And she got what she wanted.
I'm sorry?
Well, the victim did die before she could marry the defendant's son. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is right.
The defendant had said that if she could push a button and make the victim disappear, she would absolutely do it.
Yeah, that's right.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Anything further from this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Brief redirect.
You may proceed.
Mr. Lewis, I wanted to clarify. Was everyone at Peony Estates trained on pesticide safety?
Of course. I mean, safety is my top priority. We had to make sure that all of our employees knew how dangerous they could be.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. No further questions.
Anything further from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor.
All right.
This witness may be excused.
May we call our next witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
The defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
You may proceed.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Would you please introduce yourself to the court?
My name is Harper Martini.
Miss Martini, what do you do for a living?
I'm a businesswoman. In fact, I recently made it on Midland's 40 under 40 list of successful businesswomen.
What business do you own?
I own the winery, Peony Estates. I built my business from the ground up, and it's the second best thing in my life.
The second best thing, what's the first?
My son, Casey. He's the most important part of my life. I raised him by myself, and I'm so proud to see him grow into a strong young man.
Miss Martini, you're being accused of poisoning Genesis Petrillo, so I want to ask right out of the gate. Did you poison her?
No, of course not. Genesis and I may have had our differences, but I would never harm someone that my son loved.
Did you have any reason to poison Miss Petrillo?
Absolutely not. I would never poison the woman my son loved. I would never poison my own wine with pesticide. Because of what happened that day, I've lost the two most important things in my life. My winery is closing down permanently, and Casey hasn't spoken to me since.
Well, let's back up, Miss Martini. How do you know Genesis Petrillo?
Genesis was my son Casey's fiance. I've known her for many years, ever since they started dating.
And what was your relationship like with her?
It wasn't perfect. I didn't support her relationship with Casey.
Why didn't you support them?
Well, Casey was set to inherit all the money from my winery, and whoever married him would get it too. Casey always paid for everything in the relationship. It seemed like all Genesis cared about was money, and that was even before I found out about Paris.
What do you mean you found out about Paris?
Genesis sent me a voicemail late one night. She told me that she and Casey were moving to France, and I would never see them again. I just know Genesis was using Casey for a free ride to Paris.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, we're not we're not offering this for the truth that Genesis was using Casey for a free ride, but rather Miss Martini's state of mind and her belief, which is relevant to how she felt about Genesis Petrillo.
I'll allow it.
So, Miss Martini, when you heard this voicemail, what did you do?
I couldn't let my son be taken advantage of like that. I wanted to see if Genesis would still marry Casey if she didn't have our money. So I decided to test Genesis. She could either take a check for $300,000 and leave our family alone, or she could marry Casey and I would take her out of the will.
And how did Miss Petrillo respond to this letter?
She told me that she loved Casey and didn't want my money, so she threw the letter back. When she refused, I realized and I thought that maybe I was wrong about Genesis. Maybe she really cared for Casey. At that point, I realized I had to make peace with Genesis.
How did you try to make peace with her?
I spoke to her several times, and I even invited her to lunch. I then decided to give Genesis a gift to symbolize the start of our new relationship.
And what was that gift?
Our new line of wine had not been released yet, so I decided to dedicate it to Genesis. Casey often called Genesis Cara Mia, which means my love in Italian. I named the bottle Cara after their relationship.
What happened after you gave Miss Petrillo that bottle of wine?
I had the photographer take some photos of Genesis holding the wine to use as promotion for our new line. I was thrilled to see how happy Casey and Genesis were that night.
What did you do after those promotion photos were taken?
I was exhausted by the event, and after seeing Genesis and Casey happy together, I decided to go to bed. It wasn't until the next morning that I found out about Genesis.
How did you find out what had happened to Miss Petrillo?
I got a call from an employee that someone from my winery had been hospitalized. After seeing how much Genesis was drinking at the rehearsal dinner, I was scared that it was her.
When did you find out that Miss Petrillo had passed away?
The next morning. A friend of Casey's told me that Genesis had slipped into a coma, and a few hours later, I found out she had passed away.
Miss Martini, I want to move on to a different topic. Do you know someone named Danny Francazio?
I do. I worked for many years at his winery.
Why did you stop working for him?
I loved my job, but I always dreamed of opening my own winery.
Well, did you leave things with Mr. Francazio on good terms?
That was the plan. I had always made clear to Danny that I had goals of starting my own winery. But when I told him, he seemed shocked. Danny got so upset, he started yelling at me, and he threw my final paycheck at me. When I told him my staffing plans, it only got worse.
What were your staffing plans?
I had trained a skillful team at his winery, and I planned on offering jobs to some of the best. But when I told Danny, I'd never seen him angrier.
How did he respond to what you had told him?
Danny told me that if I was going to sabotage his business...
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay, to Danny Francazio's statements. Defense is offering these statements for the truth of the matter asserted.
Respond.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, we're not offering these for the truth of the matter, but rather for the witness's subsequent actions, Danny Francazio. If I may make an offer of proof, Your Honor?
You may.
Mr. Francazio will then go on to ban Harper Martini from his winery, showing the relationship between the two of them was not good.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes, you may.
They're using the statement Danny Francazio said, which is saying that he would do anything to make Harper pay. Your Honor, this is their exact theory today. They're not just using this for the effect of the listener. As the defense counsel said, they're using this to show that Danny Francazio told her that she would be banned from the winery. Your Honor, that's another hearsay statement that they're using for the truth of the matter asserted today.
I sustain the objection.
Move to strike.
Granted.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Martini, how did your winery do in comparison to Mr. Francasio's?
According to the press, my winery became more popular than his.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay. The only way that Ms. Martini would know this is through the hearsay statements of the press or a magazine saying that her company was doing better than Danny Francasio's.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes, you may.
We're not offering this for the truth of the matter, but we're offering it to show Danny Francasio's subsequent actions. He will, Your Honor, if I may make an offer of proof, Mr. Francasio will then call Harper Martini and make statements regarding his intent to ruin her winery. Your Honor, if opposing counsel would like, we're happy to put a limiting instruction on this statement, to not offer it for the truth of the matter.
You haven't laid a predicate for her personal knowledge, so I'm going to sustain the objection.
Move to strike.
Granted.
Your Honor, may I inquire as to what specific foundation you would like us to lay?
Whether she has personal knowledge of a comparison of the two wineries.
Absolutely, Your Honor. We can lay that foundation. Ms. Martini, are you aware of any public rankings of your winery compared to Danny Francasio's?
Yes. A well-known magazine gave us a glowing review and ranked us the #1 winery in Midlands, while Danny was in second place.
And do you know how Mr. Francasio responded to this second place ranking?
I do. The night the article was published, Danny called me, screaming about how I had ruined him.
Again, objection, Your Honor, to the hearsay statements of this call.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
If Ms. Martini is allowed to finish her statement, she'll testify that Danny Francasio told her specifically that he planned to take back that #1 spot, and he would make sure that Peony Estates Winery became nothing if it was the last thing he did. While that is a hearsay statement, it does fall under the exception 8033, state of mind as a statement of intent.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Under Rule 8033, a then existing a mental, emotional, or physical condition, a then existing state of mind is something that, for intent, an example of intent is, I'm going to kick a ball. It's not, I'm going to make you make your business pay, or I'm going to become #1. Your Honor, the defense is claiming today that Danny Francasio poisoned Miss Martini's wine. That's a very specific statement, and Danny Francasio is not saying that. They're using the statement for the truth of the matter asserted.
I sustain the objection.
Move to strike.
Granted.
Miss Martini, have you ever seen Danny Francasio at your winery?
No, but I have seen one of his employees before.
When did you see one of his employees?
A few weeks before the wedding. I saw someone who I recognized as one of Danny's employees from my time working there. I figured they were snooping around for our upcoming wine blend, but as soon as they saw me, they bolted off the property.
Did you see anything else?
Nothing else looked different in the bottling area, but as they were leaving, they dropped a canister of pesticide.
Did you pick up that canister?
I did. It was nearly empty, so I threw it away. And it was the same brand of pesticide that we use.
Thank you, Miss Martini. Your Honor, nothing further at this time.
Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Martini, I want to start with something that you just said on direct. You said that you saw one of Danny Francasio's employees at your winery.
Yes, I did.
You said that you saw this employee drop a canister of pesticides.
That's what I said, yes.
Well, Ms. Martini, just to be clear, this is the first time we're hearing this, isn't that right?
Well, I just am here to tell the court what I saw, so that's what I said.
So, Ms. Martini, that is correct. This is the first time that we are hearing this statement that you saw one of Danny Francasio's employers at your winery, or that they dropped a bottle of pesticides.
Yes.
And the reason that we're hearing this for the first time today is because that's the story that you and your attorneys came up with, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Your Honor, this is cross.
Your Honor.
Overruled.
Yes.
Ms. Martini, is that a yes to my question?
I'm just here to tell the facts of what I saw, and this is what I saw.
Okay, Miss Martini. Well, I want to start by talking about what you know and what you knew on June 7th. On June 7th, 2019, you knew how to access pesticides at your company, right?
Our winery used pesticides, so yes.
You knew that pesticides were meant to kill pests.
That's what they're for.
Miss Martini, you saw the victim as a pest, didn't you?
Well, I didn't see Genesis as a pest, but I know I did say that once.
Exactly. You said that Genesis was a pest and pesticides were for to kill pests like her, right?
Right, that's what I said.
Miss Martini, on June 7th, you knew that mixing pesticide and wine was deadly, right?
Yeah, one of our employees once got sick because of it.
Well, now that we've talked about what you knew, I want to talk about what you were feeling around the time of June 7th. You had just found out that your son was planning on moving to France with the victim.
Yes.
You told the victim that there's nothing you wouldn't do to stop her from taking your son away from you, right?
I knew that Genesis was using Casey, and I couldn't let my son be taken advantage of like that.
Well, Miss Martini, I'm not asking you to speculate about what you think Genesis was trying to do. I'm asking you that you told the victim there was nothing you wouldn't do to stop her from taking your son away from you. And that's right, isn't it?
Yes, I wanted to protect my son like any other mother would.
You said that not even leaving the country could save Genesis Patrillo from your wrath.
That's what I said.
You wanted nothing more than for Genesis to be gone.
No, I don't believe so.
Miss Martini, is it your testimony today that you did not want nothing more than for Genesis to be gone?
Well, I wanted Genesis out of our lives, but I believe gone is a stretch.
Miss Martini, has it always been your testimony that you did not say you wanted nothing more than for Genesis to be gone?
I did say that, but I know that Genesis was important to Casey.
Well, I want to talk about the first way that you tried to make Genesis go away. You wrote her a note offering $300,000 to leave in May of 2019, right?
Yes, I was testing Genesis.
You'd recognize a copy of that note if I showed it to you?
I would.
You offer, Your Honor, permission to show Exhibit 24.
You may.
Now, Miss Martini, this is a fair and accurate photo of the note you wrote, right?
Yes, I believe it is.
Your Honor, plaintiff moves to enter Exhibit 24 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
It's admitted. Exhibit 24 is admitted.
Now, Miss Martini, on this note, you said that if Genesis doesn't leave by June 7th, you'd take her out the hard way, right?
Yes, I meant that I would take her out of the will.
Oh, Miss Martini, again, just to be clear, this is the first time we're hearing any explanation about a will, right?
Well, that's what I told Genesis at the time, so that's what I said.
But Miss Martini, again, this is the first time we're hearing anything about a will.
I believe so.
And again, the reason that we're hearing this now is because that's the story you made up with your attorneys.
That's what happened, and that's what I'm telling the court.
So, Miss Martini, June 7th arrived, and the victim didn't leave like you told her to.
No, Genesis didn't take the money, so I believe that she had the right intentions.
Actually, Miss Martini, on June 7th, Genesis threw that note back in your face, didn't she?
Yes, she did.
She laughed at you.
Yes.
Miss Martini, in your ideal world, you'd make Genesis disappear, right?
Well, I would like it if Genesis would leave, but that's not what Casey wanted.
That's a yes to my question, Miss Martini, that in your ideal world, you'd make Genesis disappear.
Yes.
So you decided to make your ideal world a reality, right?
I don't know what you're referring to, counsel.
Well, you decided to take Miss Patrillo out the hard way.
Well, no, Genesis did not accept the money I offered her, so I did not take her out of the will.
After Genesis threw that note in your face, you went to go grab that bottle of Cara wine.
It was a gift for Genesis, so yes.
Exactly. That bottle was specifically for Genesis, and you took it to the kitchen.
Yes.
That kitchen is exactly where Miss Arnold testified earlier today to seeing you with a bottle of pesticides and that bottle of wine, right?
I believe that's what Miss Arnold said, yes.
And that's when you poisoned that bottle of wine, didn't you?
I did not.
And that's when then you gave that bottle to Genesis.
I gave the bottle of Cara to Genesis, yes.
Miss Martini, let's talk about what happened the next day. Actually, that night you heard someone call you and say that someone was rushed to the hospital, like you said on direct.
Yes, early the next morning.
The first thing you did was you went to go check Genesis' room, right?
Yes.
You saw that empty bottle of Cara wine laying on the ground.
Yeah, it was empty, so I threw it away.
Miss Martini, you actually threw that bottle in a dumpster, right?
I threw it in the trash, so yes.
Miss Martini, you threw this bottle away at 2:30 in the morning.
I wanted to clean up Genesis' room, so yeah, that's what I did.
Miss Martini, the reason that you wanted to throw this bottle away is because you were trying to get away with poisoning Miss Patrillo, right?
No.
The next morning, Genesis was dead.
That's what happened.
Miss Patrillo, today you heard Dr. Kwan testify to pesticide being in her blood.
That's what I believe Dr. Kwan said, yes.
Miss Martini, you're happy Genesis is dead, aren't you?
I am not happy. No.
Well, you're happy the victim isn't in your life anymore, right?
A part of me might be, but most of me is devastated that Casey has to go through this.
Well, Miss Patrillo, that's a yes to my question, that you're happy Miss Patrillo is not in your life anymore.
A part of me is yes.
No further questions.
Anything further?
Yes, Your Honor, a brief redirect, if I may.
You may proceed.
Now, Miss Martini, on cross-examination, opposing counsel asked you if you put pesticide in the wine bottle on the night of the wedding rehearsal. Do you remember that?
I remember counsel asking me about that, yes.
Well, could you tell us about the process for bottling wine?
Yes. Winemaking is a long process. I had bottled the Cara wine a month prior, and I set it aside to give to Genesis as a wedding gift.
So, just to be clear, on June 7th, when you were in the kitchen with Sam Arnold, was the bottle of Cara wine corked and sealed?
Yes, it had been corked and sealed a month ago.
Now, I also want to talk about the note that opposing counsel talked to you about. Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel will be sharing a copy of Exhibit 24. Now, Miss Martini, she pointed out the phrase, "I'll take you out of the picture the hard way." What did you mean when you said that?
I meant that if Genesis was going to choose to marry Casey, and didn't take the money, then I would take her out of my will.
And did you explain this to Miss Patrillo?
I did. When I gave Genesis the note, I told her exactly what I meant.
Thank you, co-counsel. Your Honor, nothing further at this time. May Miss Martini resume her seat at counsel's table?
Nothing further from.
Oh, yes, of course, barring any recross, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor, I have a recross.
Okay.
Ms. Martini, I just want to talk about what your defense counsel just said. She went into the corking process of your winery.
Yes.
Just to be clear, you own a winery.
I do. I own Peony Estates.
You've been in winemaking all your life, right?
All of my life, yes.
So, Ms. Martini, you want the jury to believe that you don't know how to uncork and recork a wine bottle?
Well, I would know how to do that, but since wine is made so long ago, I made the bottle a month ago.
Ms. Martini, let's talk more about that note. Nothing in that note, does it say anything about a will?
Again, it's not in the note, but I explained it to Genesis when I gave her the note.
Ms. Martini, it's not on that note because you came up with it in court today, isn't that right?
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered on the initial cross-examination.
All out.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Martini, the reason that it was not on that note is because you came up with that explanation in court today, right?
No.
No further questions.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor. May Miss Martini resume her seat?
Yes.
And with that, Your Honor, the defense rests its case in chief, and we request a brief 10-minute recess before closing arguments.
All right. How will you all notify me that you're ready to proceed? Will you come back and make the announcement?
Absolutely, Your Honor. We can come back at 7:06 if that's okay with opposing counsel.
That's fine with us, Your Honor.
We're on break.
Thank you, Your Honor.
right, I'm gonna change.
Your Honor, defense counsel and I believe plaintiff counsel are here and ready to begin when you are.
That is correct, Your Honor.
All right. Are we both ready, both sides ready for closing arguments?
Yes, Your
Your Honor.
Plaintiff's counsel, do you need any time warnings or anything from me, or do you have counsel that will help you with that?
I have a counsel that will help me, Your Honor.
All right. You may proceed with your closing.
May it please the court. Follow the poison from the defendant to the bottle to the blood. Members of the jury, today you didn't hear a typical case of any in-laws that didn't get along. You didn't hear disagreements about floral arrangements and wedding dresses. You heard about threats, violent threats, and an ultimatum. An ultimatum on a woman's life. Well, you got the chance to see that ultimatum today in court. Leave by the 7th, or I will take you out the hard way. Members of the jury, this story is no mystery. By the next morning, the victim was dead with poison in the wine in her stomach and poison in her blood. It's clear the defendant followed through with his promise and took her out the hard way. But as a plaintiff, I can't just say that to you. We had a burden to prove to you. We brought a claim of battery against the defendant. And that means we had to prove to you 3 elements by a preponderance of the evidence. That the defendant committed an act, that she did so intending to cause harm, and that it did cause harm. Now, members of the jury, despite the similarities, today wasn't a criminal murder trial. We didn't have to prove our elements beyond a reasonable doubt, but simply more likely than not. Our job was much easier. And let's talk about how we met that burden, starting with the act. The question you must ask yourself is it more likely than not that the defendant poisoned the bottle of wine? I expect in a few moments, defense counsel is going to get up here and say that no one saw the defendant poison this bottle, so there was no act. But members of the jury, of course the defendant didn't poison this bottle in front of other people. But she got kind of close. You heard from that chef at the kitchen that saw the defendant standing with this bottle of wine and a canister of pesticide in that completely empty kitchen. Members of the jury, this is when you can consider the defendant's words and her state of mind. Even though nobody saw her, it's clear what she was feeling. Pesticide is for pests like Genesis. You heard that she told the victim to drink this when she's alone, that it's just for her. So at this point, it becomes more likely than not that in a moment of fury, when she was in that kitchen alone and had the means, motive, and opportunity, the defendant poisoned that bottle. Next, let's talk about intent. This question in front of you is, did the defendant intend to cause harm when committing the act? And the answer to that is clear. You heard during Ms. Layton's cross-examination of the defendant that she knew that pesticides could be deadly, that she knew they could go undetected in the bottle. And you heard about her motive, that there's no way this was some accident. She admitted that in an ideal world, she would make the victim disappear. Then during the testimony of her son, you heard that she said, "I don't care if you end up dead, my son is staying with me." We didn't even have to prove that the defendant wanted to kill Genesis, but at the very least, it's more likely than not that she was intending to cause harm. Let's talk about how we proved harm. We brought you Dr. Kwan, and she showed you every test, every result, every symptom that led her to conclude that the victim died because she was poisoned. But for the defendant poisoning that bottle of wine, Genesis would still be with us today. But in order to distract you from this evidence, the defense called some witnesses of their own, who did nothing but prove our case even more. You heard from the winemaker. He heard the defendant say, "If I could push a button to make Genesis disappear, I absolutely would." And the defendant came up on the stand and admitted she wanted nothing more than for Genesis to be gone. She's happy Genesis is no longer in her life. Don't listen to the excuses she came up with her attorneys and told us on the stand for the first time today. Listen to what she said when she was at her angriest. Listen to what she said when she had nothing to lose. Don't just follow the poison, but follow the evidence and the story her own words tell. Now, members of the jury, the defense didn't have a burden in today's case. But because they did decide to tell you a story, you have the right to analyze it and decide if it's logical. The defense agrees that the victim died from pesticide poisoning. They agree someone killed her intentionally. The only thing they want you to disagree on is who did it. So that's when you can weigh the evidence. Then that's when our burden of a preponderance of the evidence really comes in. What's more likely? That some random person the defendant made up on the stand today when she has everything to lose? A person they didn't call to testify? That they just so happened to kill the one person the defendant hated, threatened, and wanted gone? Or is it more likely that the defendant followed through with this ultimatum and poisoned that bottle when she was alone in that kitchen? That she followed through on her threats and promises and made her ideal world a reality? Members of the jury, let's think about June 7th. Genesis Petrillo was getting ready to marry the man she loves. She was getting ready to walk down the aisle and live out her dreams of moving to France. She never got that chance. She was so close, but the defendant decided that she saw her as a pest. She was going to kill her as if she was one, with pesticide. She didn't deserve to die that way, members of the jury. She didn't deserve to die at all. But the power to bring Genesis justice is in your hands. Find the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
Defense ready to close?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
She poisoned his business, so Danny Francasio poisoned her wine. Over the course of today's trial, the plaintiff has told you a story. The story of an evil mother who hated her daughter-in-law enough to poison her. In their rush to blame someone, anyone, for what happened to Genesis Petrillo, they failed to see who was really responsible for what happened that night. They failed to see that it was Danny Francasio. Now, members of the jury, I want this to be a conversation. I'm going to tell you about the burden that the plaintiff had to prove today. I'm going to tell you how the plaintiff failed to meet that burden with the evidence that they provided to you. And then we're going to talk about who really was responsible for poisoning that wine. So we'll start at the beginning. The plaintiff has brought one claim of battery against Harper Martini, so they hold the burden of proof in today's case. It's their job and their job alone to prove that it was Miss Martini specifically who poisoned that bottle of wine, and that they had to prove that she had an intent to harm Miss Petrillo. And they failed to meet that burden today. They failed to prove how or when Miss Martini poisoned that bottle of wine. Think back to today's trial. 6 different witnesses testified, and not one of them saw Miss Martini putting pesticide into the bottle of wine. Now, Mr. Pineda got up and told you today that Sam Arnold saw Miss Martini with pesticide on a counter nearby. But members of the jury, it was a winery. They used pesticide regularly. But what's more is that that bottle of wine had been bottled weeks prior to June 7th. So even if Miss Martini was holding a canister of pesticide that day, there was no way it could get into a wine bottle that had been corked and sealed weeks ago. Now, the plaintiff has also failed to prove that Miss Martini had any real intent in today's case. Now, sure, they showed you a lot of bad quotes that Miss Martini said about Miss Petrillo. And we're not contesting it, members of the jury. There's no doubt. Harper Martini didn't like Miss Petrillo. She was her mother-in-law. They fought all the time because that's what families do. But you see, all that fighting, it made Miss Martini the perfect person for the plaintiff to blame. But there's a problem with that accusation. When you go back into the deliberation room today, Judge Korb is going to instruct you on the meaning of intent. So I want you to remember this moment. I want you to ask yourself what the plaintiff is asking you to believe. We know that Miss Martini cared about two things in the world: her son and her winery. And because of what happened on June 8th, 2019, she lost both of those things. Her son hasn't spoken to her in over a year. Her winery is shut down permanently. The plaintiff is asking you to believe that Miss Martini hated Genesis Petrillo enough to poison her, that she would do it in the most obvious way possible, in front of everyone they knew at a rehearsal dinner, where people were taking pictures, that she would put pesticide in her own brand of wine, ruining the reputation of her winery in the process. Members of the jury, it doesn't make sense that Miss Martini would risk everything just because she didn't like who her son was marrying. So the question arises, who did poison that pesticide? Who stood to gain from what happened on June 8th, 2019? Now keep in mind, as opposing counsel told you, as the defense, we don't have a burden in today's case. We don't have to prove who poisoned that wine. All that matters is that the plaintiff had to prove that it was Miss Martini, and they failed to do so. But today, we showed you evidence that the person responsible was Danny Francasio. You see, Mr. Francasio used to own the most successful winery in all of Midlands. Even Miss Martini used to work for him. He took Miss Martini under his wing, gave her promotions, taught her everything he knew, let her bring her kid to the winery to play. According to Mr. Francasio, Harper Martini was practically family. Until a couple years ago, when she took half of his staff and started her own competitive winery. To put salt in the wound, she was his only direct competitor, taking business away from him constantly, the last of which was the wedding of Genesis Petrillo, as you heard today in court. Members of the jury, you heard today that Danny Francasio felt betrayed, that he told his former employee, Austin Lewis, he would do whatever it took, no matter how long it took, to make sure that Harper's winery failed. And so when her winery stole his prize title of the best winery in Midlands, that was the last straw. He sent one of his employees into Peony Estates to put just a little bit of pesticide in the barrel of wine so anyone who drank it would get sick and the winery would be forced to shut down. Members of the jury, you heard from Miss Martini. She recognized one of her old co-workers from Danny Francasio's winery on Peony Estates property. She tried to go talk to them, but they bolted. But while they were running, they dropped an empty canister of pesticide. Members of the jury, that's how the pesticide got into the wine. Now, we're not asking you to believe that Danny Francasio wanted to kill Genesis Petrillo, but today you heard from Dr. Cannon, an expert toxicologist, who explained how alcohol can exacerbate the effects of pesticide poisoning, how Miss Petrillo had been drinking the night of her wedding rehearsal. And that alcohol, it negatively interacted with the pesticide and it caused her to die. She was the collateral damage of an angry businessman. Members of the jury, the plaintiff has failed to meet their burden. They failed to prove battery by a preponderance of the evidence, which is why we ask that you find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Your Honor. May it please the court. Members of the jury, do these words look like that of a normal family? A normal mother-in-law relationship? Do these? No, these were violent threats, an ultimatum the defendant followed through on. Their story about Danny Francasio, it's a ghost story. He's a scapegoat. Follow the evidence you were actually given, members of the jury, and it's clear what the most likely explanation is. The defendant followed through on her promise. Find her liable for battery. Thank you.
All right, I don't have a script, but I assume the next job is to have the judges do the voting. And
Yes, Your Honor. Oh, I noticed that they said they wanted a roster for who did which examinations. We wanted to ask if it would be helpful if we all turned on our cameras so they could see who's who.
absolutely.
And would the judges that were inquiring about this, is it clear now who Director who would really like us to also remind who each person's witness was? Because we can do that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, y'all having your cameras on is all that I needed. Thank you. Are we missing somebody? There we go.
If the other judge is good, I'm done and I don't need to see you on screen anymore.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks, guys.
All right, Haley and Camille, at this point, do we give feedback to the group, or is that the next step?
Yes, and I think we have 10 minutes total for the three of us. So.
Well, let me go first. I know I wasn't scoring the match, but I'm really glad I wasn't, because I thought it was a really, really difficult match to score. I thought both teams did just an excellent job, and it was very close. I really liked the fact that in plaintiff's theory of the case, they really integrated well the defendant's statements and did a great job bringing that information out. Really brought it home, especially in the closings. I liked your presentation in the closings with the defendant statements. I thought all the crosses were really great. I thought y'all did a good job thinking on your feet, and bringing out points on crosses. I was really impressed. So I think all of y'all did a great job. And the witnesses, man, you guys got into character and stayed in character. So that was pretty good on y'all's part.
Thank you.
Haley and Camille, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Can you hear me? I agree with Mr. Korb. I thought everybody did a really good job. I have one sort of somewhat pervasive comment to make for that several of you did, which is that when you were talking, you were doing what I'm doing right now. You were looking at your screen, but what captures people's attention better is if you look directly into the camera, and it actually helps them know that oh, I'm looking at you, as it would be in real life. And so that was kind of, not everybody had this problem, but it was, especially for openings and closings, I think it mattered a little bit more. But I think overall, everybody did a really good job. And I agree that it was a tough, pretty close decision.
So I don't have a webcam, so I can't share my screen, but I did mock trial with Baylor, actually. So I'm coming at it from like a competitor perspective, not necessarily like a law perspective, but I think you all did a very good job. The only comments that I have that I think apply to like the group is that there's a lot of people in the case, and having never heard it before, especially in openings, I was really confused about like what was going on and who was who. So I think spending a little bit more time explaining like the relationships would be helpful for me as someone who hadn't heard this case before, to know like who everybody was. The other thing is, I would have liked to see I know it's hard with Zoom, but not that many exhibits came into the round, and I obviously don't know what the exhibits are, but I feel like I would have liked to see a little bit more use of the ones that you entered and just kind of used overall. But this was a very close round, and I think you guys all did a really good job. So good luck with the rest of the season.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we done, or do we need to stay on until one of the moderators come back?
Did you text Elliot Riches to tell him that we had finished our round? I can do that if you'd like.
It'd be great.
And just to be clear, are judges supposed to do that, or were we supposed to?
I think it was the judges, but
Awesome.
It's the judge, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you guys so much, and to the other team, like, amazing round. Oh, we're great.
Do y'all have any questions for us? I don't know. I don't know how to give better like specific feedback. So if you had any questions.
Yeah, were you like a ballot judge? Because it can be more helpful to just read individual things.
Okay, sure.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, do you guys want to know what schools we're from? Or are we
Yes.
allowed? Yeah. So we're from UT Austin.
We're from UC Berkeley in California.
Y'all, Zoom allows like more, like connections between people that we wouldn't see at Texas tournaments. So that was pretty awesome to see.
So are you all mainly upperclassmen?
Our team is mostly underclassmen, actually.
Okay.
I'm not, but credit to the rest of them. They're all very good, especially just getting onto the team.
We're diverse. Sorry, Heather.
No, you got it. You take it away.
I was just saying we're diverse. We have some sophomores, some juniors, some freshmen, all the people.
So Elliot just texted and let me know that all of our ballots have been turned in, so we are good to go if you guys don't have anything else.
Awesome.
The defense is great. Thank you guys so much for scoring and judging.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Good night, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate it.
Good luck, UT Austin.